Oxford and the second Internet Politics and Policy Conference. This conference is convened by the Oxford Internet Institute, a department of the University of Oxford looking at life online, and the journal Policy and Internet. I'm Helen Margetts, Director of the Oxford Internet Institute and editor of the journal. The other editors are Sandra Gonzalez-Bayon and David Sutcliffe, and they're in the audience just as everybody else that I'm going to mention is, I hope at least. So this is the second conference that we've had. The last one was 2 years ago, and I know that some of you, but by no means all of you, were at that conference as well. As a German friend of mine says, in this country, meaning Britain, once you've done something twice, it's a tradition. So hopefully now it's a tradition. I must say it does seem to have been popular, although we have a much narrower, more focused topic for the conference this time, the theme of big data. It's been very popular. It's sold out. We've had to turn people away. I like to think of this conference as kind of small for an academic conference, but perfectly formed. I think last time there's about 115 of you. I said last time that we were just around Dunbar's number of 100 people, which is supposed to be just the maximum number of people who can happily interact together and form a community. So we've got some more people than that this year, but I think we're still round about the median number of Facebook friends and Twitter followers. So it should be possible for you to form some enjoyable and useful interactions during the course of the next 2 days, and increase your number of friends and followers, of course. The topic we chose this year is big data. The rationale for that was that now that so many of us live so much of our lives on internet platforms, we leave a massive digital imprint, and that imprint is generating big data, which has all sorts of possibilities for both research and for policy making, the key theme of the journal. In my view, this is a really exciting time for the social sciences in particular. It's giving us the same sort of data that scientists have. Real-time transactional data about what people really did instead of survey data about what people think they did or think they might do. Sometimes there's too much of it instead of too little. We've got a new big data project at the Oxford Internet Institute where we are going to analyse the entire the web archive of the entire .uk domain for the last 15 years, 40 terabytes of compressed data. Whichever way you look at it, that's big, but it's a major challenge to us as social scientists to analyse. It's bringing all of us, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the kind of challenges that's bringing us. Big data's got no handy demographics attached. We don't know where people have come from. We don't know where we're going. It's not like a survey data in that respect. It can be really challenging to work out what it actually means or how to analyse it. Sometimes it's so complex that visualisation just has to be part of the narrative, and that's one of the key themes of this conference. Those challenges need new expertise, new skills. Lots of you here possess some of those skills, but not all of them, and collaboration across disciplines. This is a truly multidisciplinary conference. And the development of methods, which is what we're going to be discussing in the coming days, and entirely passing geographical boundaries, I hope. We worked out just before everybody arrived that there are people from 18 countries here, which is not bad for a conference just over 100. There is another reason to have this conference on big data. In the commercial world, big data has really become hyped to the hilt. It's the buzziest of buzzwords. Corporations are falling over themselves to produce huge and often slightly dubious in methodological terms reports on big data. Every day there is some kind of big data news stories of the kind of Walmart knows that your teenage daughter is pregnant before you do variety. But in terms of providing public value in making government and policy making more efficient, more realistic, better quality, there's been far less attention. So that's what makes me really pleased that we've chosen this theme for this conference and can start the debate over the possibilities and the problems for public policy making. And that's going to be the theme of the panel, which we're going to move on to as soon as I've finished, which is going to set the scene, I hope, for the conference. Just before we go there, and it won't be long, I'd like to say a few words about the institutions behind this conference. First, the journal, Policy and Internet. Since we last had the conference, the journal's had a slightly hectic year in terms of publishers. It started off with Berkeley Electronic Press, moved on to De Gruyter, and is now in the safe hands of Wiley-Blackwell. So we're very excited about that. It's a kind of new era for the journal. There's a new website. You can find it here, and hopefully when you Google Policy and Internet, and a new blog, a Policy and Internet blog waiting in the wings to accompany it. Citations, downloads, all the indicators for the journal are looking very good. Wiley are very kindly offering free access for 2 years to the articles in the journal. All research shows that the more something is available online, the higher the citations go. So we're very happy for the future. I think the journal really is well on its way for being a primary forum for discussion of the relationship between public policy and the internet. I don't think there's any other forum quite like it. There's going to be a special issue on big data from this conference, so some people have submitted their papers already. Please do so in the month after the conference if you'd like your paper to be in the special issue. I think it will be a really, really good special issue. And, sorry, I've got a housekeeping note. Oh, yes. Also, I want to thank our sponsors, the sponsors of the conference. The Policy Studies Organisation, who own the journal, and the president, Paul Rich, is here in the front row. Also, the American Public University, whose president and vice presidents are also here. They funded, as well as sponsoring the conference, they funded 2 student bursaries for students to travel from the US, and are convening a panel on the use of big data in education research tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I'd like to encourage people to come to that. Education is a kind of big policy area where big data is a kind of undiscovered, uncharted field, so it's exciting to hear about research in that area. Tableau have also sponsored 2 bursaries for students, and I think Andy Cotgrave is also here and will be demonstrating visualization software during the next 2 days. Google has sponsored one of the poster and paper prizes, and this conference is convened in collaboration with the standing group of the European Consortium of Political Research on the internet and politics. There's a meeting for that first thing tomorrow, also at 9 o'clock. Any political scientists among you, please do come to that meeting if you're in the ECPR or interested in the ECPR. We'll move on to the panel in 1 second. I just have a few housekeeping issues, as all conferences start with. Don't forget the poster session at lunchtime tomorrow. There was one, some of you were at the posters today. They'll also be there at tea and coffee. And tea, coffee and lunch will all be in that room where lunch was just now. If you get lost or don't know where anything is, look for somebody with an orange badge, because we're the people who know where things are. There's wireless network codes in the delegate packs. You need to connect to OWL first, but the instructions should make that clear. All plenary and keynote sessions are being recorded. Seminar room 3 is available as a sort of breakout room for anybody who wants to use it. It's free all the time. There's a map of the whole site, which is slightly confusing, especially for anyone like me who wanted to find somewhere to put their bicycle, in the delegate packs, and that also shows all the fire assembly points and everything like that. the sessions are quite tight. The schedule's quite tight. We've packed a lot into these 1.5 days. So if you could try and load your presentations onto laptops in the room in advance, that would be really good. It is possible for people to use their own laptops, but we'd much rather you use the one that's there already. It'll make things much quicker, unless there's some technical reason why you have to. We made the decision not to have formal dinners at this conference, so there is no formal dinner. The hypothesis being that you tend to, it depends whether you get lucky at a formal dinner with the people you're sitting near, and that receptions give you much more of a chance to walk around and talk to people and generally network. So we've got 2 receptions in 2 lovely venues in Oxford, one the Ashmolean Museum where we were last year, and also the Natural History Museum. We will try to feed you at those receptions, but if you've got a big appetite and you feel the need, there won't actually be any kind of sit-down dinner or kind of knife and fork type dinner, so if you need that, I'm afraid you will have to go for dinner. I also have to say that there'll be no red wine. This isn't because we haven't read the big data research on how good red wine is for you, it's because neither of these venues will allow us to use red wine. They obviously have a poor opinion of academics, that they won't be able to control their red wine and that it will go on their beautiful white walls. I don't know, but anyway, that's the explanation for that. Okay, so I think that's all. I wish you a really good 2 days. I'm certainly really looking forward to it. And I think we'll move straight on to the panel, so I shall hand over to Victoria Nash from the Oxford Internet Institute, who's going to chair that.
Great introduction from Helen. You can see how organised we are, that I'm still checking the last minute details. It's a pleasure to be chairing this session. I'm Vicky Nash. I'm a Policy and Research Fellow at the OII, and I think in this context it's the policy bit that's led to me chairing this session. For my sins, after I finished my DPhil, I spent a couple of years in a think tank, and we were always told that the 2 things we were looking for was either evidence of some sort of malpractice by the sort of opposition party or new data. So I think, obviously, one of the sort of really exciting things to talk about today is precisely what politicians and policymakers can expect from the promise of big data. We've got 4 wonderful panellists here whom we shall take in turn. As we said earlier, that's actually being webcast after the event, and recorded for that purpose. So actually, if you can hold your questions, if you like, until everybody's finished speaking, it means, A, that you'll be able to sort of, fully reflect on what you want to ask, and also that you won't get recorded in the middle. The 4 speakers we have, Helen, you've already met. Then immediately to my right, we have Lance Bennett, Professor of Communication and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington, whose work, I have to say, is on most of our reading lists, I think, at the OII. To my left, somebody from Oxford who I've never met before, so I'm looking forward to hearing him talk. Patrick McSharry from the Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment. And you're our token mathematician, I think, on this panel, which is great. And then at the end here, we have Theo Bertram, previously an academic, is that right? On Samuel Beckett.
Quite a long time ago.
A long time ago. Policy advisor, though, to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and now UK policy manager at Google. So I will now be quiet. You each have up to about 10 minutes, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
Thank you.
I'm going to be very short because you've heard from me already. I'll just explain the idea behind having this panel. The argument being that public policy is aimed at changing societal behaviour. If we were going to sum up public policy in a sentence, it's where the state meets the outside world and either tries to make a difference or tries to conserve what is there. Big data offers enormous scope for understanding people's needs, preferences and behaviour. It basically gives government new information about what people want, what they need and what they do. It helps us to understand what they're willing or not willing to do in terms of civic engagement or in complying with legislative change. Lance is going to talk about the former of those, about their willingness, the people's willingness or not to engage civically. By identifying patterns and trends in the natural world as well as the social one, it allows policymakers to see into the future, to be prepared, aware of risks, and to design policy accordingly. I think Patrick is going to say something about that. Big data could, and sometimes I think you can't say can, you have to say could, because we're nowhere near that. As I was saying before, I think the public sector governments lag behind firms in their use of big data. But it could act as a major barometer of public services, identify the failing hospital, the murderous GP, the struggling school, without major inspection regimes or intrusive. It can do that in a non-obtrusive way. It makes it possible to understand which incentives will work and under what circumstances. It can be used to personalise public services, so-called MyGov, and design policy and administrative change in a way that is realistic and resource efficient. It allows for new kinds of state design. It allows an intelligence centre and a devolved delivery design. That's the kind of organisational design that allows organisations to respond quickly to exogenous shocks like natural disasters, earthquakes, for example. But there's a lot of challenges to all that. I mean, that's all what could happen. And I think we're all aware, and that's what we're going to be talking about over the next days, of the challenges it brings, both in terms of reaching that point, of attaining those benefits, and the ethical challenges that it brings. I'm only going to mention three because we're going to be talking about this for a while. If big data can be used to predict the future, then it allows probabilistic models of policy making based on what will probably happen. But making policy in that kind of way raises new questions of justice and equity. For example, the identifications of crime hotspots so small that we can predict crime before it happens. For example, what do we do with that information? We have to be very careful how we use that kind of information. Big data raises huge questions of privacy. And that's a bit of a tension. On the one hand, the very idea of big data is that it's so big that everyone's anonymous. If you want to lose a piece of wood, where do you hide it? In a forest? But if it's used to personalise policy or services, as it can be, via user analytics, for example, then we very quickly run the risk of de-anonymisation. And I'm sure we're all challenged by this in some way. Big data generation analysis requires expertise and skills which challenge governmental organisations in particular. Governments in general, and perhaps I should say the UK government in particular, have a rather slightly dubious record on the guardianship of large-scale data sets, on the management of large-scale technology projects, on their capacity to innovate with newer media and technologies in comparisons with firms, social enterprises and citizens themselves. Theo is going to say something about that, I think. But the intelligent centre and devolved delivery design that I mentioned is kind of something that big data allows, with an intelligent centre where all the analytical resources are, is actually almost the complete mirror image of most contemporary governments. So big data has major possibilities for state design, but is also something that has by no means been done yet. Anyway, that was just a few of the issues and the reason behind having this panel, and now I shall hand over to Lance.
Thank you. Thanks to all the organizers for producing this wonderful group that we get to enjoy for 2 days, and so I hope by the end we become acquainted and share ideas. I'm talking about, I guess the story I'm going to tell you is something titled The Perils of Technology Public Engagement, Technology-Enabled Public Engagement. By that I don't mean the Twitter crowds and the Facebook revolutions. We're going to talk a little bit about the perils and the promises of a very large Twitter stream surrounding the Occupy protests in the U.S. tomorrow morning in a panel I'm sharing with a group of colleagues from the University of Washington. But today what I want to talk about is sort of large-scale, robust platforms for public deliberation, for public decision-making and agenda setting that we now have the capacity to build and deploy in a variety of situations, and two of the people here today, Dean Freeland and Sheetal Agarwal, have been involved in a big National Science Foundation funded project that I'm involved with in Seattle that is actually licensed to build public deliberation tools and to give them away freely to publics who want to use them. And hence, that's the dramatic moment in my narrative. Who are the publics who want to use these things? Do people want to deliberate? Is there any great incentive, much less public norm, for either governments or various kinds of citizens networks to want to be more deeply engaged in the democratic process? I think the jury is out on that question, and I think it's a very serious question indeed. So we have tried to sort of shop our tools to a variety of venues, some of whom have actually happily and cheerfully adopted them and are using them prosperously. Others have turned away, even after being initially fascinated and eager to think about the prospects for more serious democratic involvement on the part of larger publics. So we've worked with civic youth online communities who have adopted some of our technologies and brought kids who really hadn't been doing anything online other than sharing SMSs, became bloggers and filmmakers and doing all kinds of interesting civic projects. We've talked to the city of Seattle. We've talked to the national federal government. We thought that it would be fascinating, for example, if the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, which has a mandate from Congress to seek citizen input on its policy regulations, wouldn't it be great if they actually wanted the public to talk about those things too? There is a black hole where you can submit your inputs, but no one ever sees where they go or what happens to them once they've been submitted. So we talked to them. We talked to the Tea Party. We've talked to Occupy. And we've got a different story to tell about all of those different civic communities. I don't have time to tell all of those stories, but I'm going to share a couple of them with you because I think they're instructive about whether people really want more democratic tools than Twitter, Facebook, and so on. Maybe that's the right size and the right level of tool for our public processes. I raise that as a question. I'm not proposing an answer either way, actually. I'm still undecided about that question myself. First, let me show the good news, though. Even in lean times, governments are tracking this stuff. The U.S. is funding a huge number of interesting projects to build large-scale, robust civic technologies of various sorts. We now have the capacity to store relatively securely, although Helen's cautionary note about the UK government notwithstanding, relatively securely the public data that these things generate. And we have one, I think, pretty successful deployment, which interestingly enough came through a network of civic organizations that wanted to use a platform we built called Consider It, get it? Consider It, for large-scale public deliberation. And we developed a crowdsourced voters guide for the state of Washington, which was used in the last election by 18,000 people who actually deliberated. They didn't flame, they didn't call each other bad names. They engaged with the tool on its own terms and exchanged ideas, brought other people's ideas, often from the other side of the political line, into their considerations, and took positions and then could interact with the database of positions taken on all kinds of different voting measures in the election. This year we're rolling it out in California as well, and we're introducing a fact check mechanism. Not that I'm convinced facts matter in politics, but we are introducing a fact check mechanism just for those who want to use it into this year's deployment. So, but now I'm afraid I have to turn a little bit to the bad news. And these involve the areas where we've had less success in getting adopters for our tools. Government, rather a large area of civic life, and social political movements, another rather large area of political life, even though they may love Twitter or not, as it turns out the case may be. Some of the most militant activists who are the last to die in these movements don't like technology all that much. And that's an interesting story about what may have happened to the Indignados, what may have happened to Occupy. As the movements declined, the most militant activists have another model of what the proper political organization looks like, and it isn't a virtual organization. It is not one in which you share the democratic experience with people you don't know who don't show up at meetings with you. So that's an interesting issue. So first of all, quickly, let me tell the story about our experiences with government. City of Seattle actually endorsed our project and helped us get funding for the NSF by promising that they were going to do all kinds of things with the tools we built. And it turns out that there were many people, and this is the story that we find time and again, at the entry levels of contact in government who love the idea of expanding the democratic involvement of citizens in all areas of government life, not just delivering services and forms more easily online, as e-government has sort of done very well at, but actually bring people into public debates about issues that matter in their everyday lives. The higher up you get in government, however, the less interest there is in that. So our contacts with government again and again have told the same story. You go in at sort of an entry level, especially the departments of technology, who are all over this stuff and they love it and they think, yeah, we can sell this to the mayor, or we can sell this to the commissioner, we can sell this to the senator. And then it turns out, oh, the senator isn't so interested in using it for purposes that we would like to see our toys used for. They want to do instant polling and more clever ways of assessing the pulse of their constituents, but not get them involved in a common decision or agenda building process. So we always hit a certain level and people go, not interested. Case in point, interestingly enough, was the Federal Communication Commission, whose main commissioner is a former communications executive. Not surprising that government regulatory agencies are run by the former members of the industries they regulate, but in any event, he was presiding over a public input process on the issue of net neutrality, which I guess everybody here knows what that is. And it's a very hot issue. It may be the most important regulatory question of our time for democratic outcomes, it would seem to me. And there was a huge public input period, as there is required to be, and we thought this would be time to introduce one of our tools to see if we could make the public input experience more transparent and let different sides engage with each other in real time and produce an interesting sort of debate about net neutrality. So we offered to build this tool free of charge, give it to the Federal Communication Commission. The policy shop liked the idea, and they circulated it up to the commissioner's level where it died. And it turns out it wasn't long before we discovered that the real input that was going on in net neutrality debate was between the big service providers and content companies behind closed doors. Eventually, the hoped-for coalition of groups like Google and Comcast blew up, and they're all fighting each other now. But at one point, I think there was hope that these big media companies would be able to write the perfect set of regulations for themselves. Okay. We learned something about that. We learned something about why it may be that government isn't so interested in having public deliberations about these kinds of serious policy questions, even though we felt we could build tools that would overcome some of the obvious questions, like flaming, of the sort that happened to the Obama administration when they used a very simple platform called IdeaScale to get public input about what it is that the Obama administration should be doing back there in 2009. And legalizing marijuana turned out to be the most important thing it could do. But we have ideas about how you could work through those obvious obstacles and get to some serious public deliberation about important issues. Let me quickly turn in closing to social movements and our work in particular with the Occupy movement, both in Seattle in a very up-close ethnographic way that Sheathel has been leading, and also our work with a national network of Occupy tech developers who did share our vision. Again, the techies tend to share the vision of let's have some nice deliberative democratic tools to deepen the experience and broaden the engagement at the same time. What we found, however, is that even though we actually got fairly far along in building a tool for Occupy, we had a whole team of techies doing amazing things like, you know, the Occupy hand signals, so there are also the Indignados hand signals. This is I approve and I disapprove and I really hate this idea and all of these things. One of our team actually built a cell phone that does all of this without you having to do all of this, so that everybody in the audience equipped with phones could simply wiggle their phone, and then on the big screen you get the number of people doing this and the number of people doing that. I'm not sure that that is actually a gain for the Occupy face-to-face assembly process, because I'm sure this is the most exciting thing that happens in many of those assemblies. But we also built a tool to address one of the issues that comes up again and again in the rituals of Occupy, and maybe also in the rituals of the Indignados, called temp check. If somebody in the crowd introduces an opinion, rather than having a big deliberation on it, you can maybe decide if it's worth deliberating by taking the temperature check of the group. So we built a temp check platform that would allow people to introduce ideas for Occupy actions, and then have a national temp check. I mean, we had enough capacity to actually go national with a temp check for people proposing ideas from pretty much anywhere. And we had some ideas about verification and trust built into the technology so that it wouldn't be taken over immediately by, say, the Tea Party, who wanted to sabotage Occupy, or vice versa. But what we learned is that the closer we got to the committed activist core, who were a dying number at this point in the spring of this year, the closer we got, the more aversion we encountered to opening up virtual democratic deliberation. So the most committed activists, and I'm guessing this is true, in fact I had a very interesting conversation at lunch about this, may be also true for the Indignados in Spain, is that the militant activists who remain at the center of this dying movement don't want a virtual democratic tool that might actually sustain larger scale involvement on the part of supportive but less militant publics in that same movement. So we have two very different stories emerging about why governments don't want more virtual democracy, and perhaps why activist social movement types may not want more virtual democracy. So I'll leave you with those two moral stories to perhaps question later. But let me quickly run through some policy implications of this, since this conference is about policy. And these aren't a real stretch. They're pretty obvious, it seems to me. One is that it seems to me that we have a gap, perhaps, in what many of us, I guess, in this room would like to see more of, namely high-powered democratic tools. We have a gap between that and the capacity to develop them, which we also can do, and public and governmental acceptance of those same tools. So how do we close that gap? That seems to me to be an education gap. It seems to me to be a political culture gap. It seems to me to be a policy gap, especially when it gets to government, who, you know, many people, the higher you get in government, just don't want to do this sort of thing. Their attitude, may be reasonable, is, hey, we just went through an election process. Can the public just leave us alone for a few years so we can do our jobs? And you can see that that's a reasonable response to people in government. On the other hand, there is some people have gone so far as to call it a legitimacy crisis, because people feel that government manipulates them to get elected and then forgets about them after they've gotten elected. And is probably more in cahoots with business than it is with some kind of public sovereign. So the question is, how can we close that gap between the values and norms that we might like to promote for public engagement through technology and the acceptance levels of government and even some citizens about those same tools? And a second, and obviously there's some implications there for public education. There's implications for a lot of things, but time is short. So let me talk about, beyond policy, some methods questions. Let's assume we solve those policy problems, let's just say. I think they're big ones, but I think we might want to focus on trying to solve them, close those gaps. I think there's still some big methods issues that are challenging us today and will challenge us even more in the future if we do solve those sort of policy norm problems. One is that if we actually got one of my fantasies to have a huge national deliberation on a big time issue facing the US public or the UK public, we would generate an enormous volume of data, just unfathomably large volume of text data and its various aggregations around issues and demographic clusters and so on. One of the things that we need to solve, and this is our next grant, because we can't single-handedly solve the policy problem, so we're working on the next stage of what we see as methods problems. The next grant is to put in for basically a team All of these projects involve very interesting teams from ethnographers to computer programmers and information curators and designers and visualization experts and so on to build a really big team to do natural language processing and visualization, so that people who are engaged in a big deliberation with 1 million or 2 million or 5 million other people have a way to quickly assess everybody else's positions in a real-time fashion and then respond to everybody else's positions. And the natural language component to that is simple but impossible. It's categorization. What is like other stuff and what's different than other stuff? I mean, it seems so intuitively obvious that you could say, oh, these positions are like each other and those positions are not like them but like each other in a particular way. It's not obvious how you do that. If you can't do that, however, you can't aggregate large responses in real time and automate the showback to people about what's just been said by different groups who we regard as substantially similar or different from each other. And if we can't do that, then we can't start branching the conversations, right? Because if you can do that, then you can say, oh, here's a branch point. A new category seems to have emerged here, and then you decide if it's a different enough category to start another deliberation or another conversation. So that's a huge challenge, and another huge challenge is visualization. You don't want people to be looking at ugly text screens. You want them to be looking at beautiful, fluid maps that show them the landscape of a public deliberation, where they are in it, and representations of where other people are in it. And these are really fascinating and wonderful problems, but I think they are issues that we're going to have to deal with. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving quickly on, Patrick.
Okay, so I guess it's probably important to put in context where I've come from. I'm a mathematician, physicist, but I work with engineers, economists, statisticians, basically anyone that's got lots of data and the problem that I might be able to help them with. So when it comes to thinking about data, big data, and what we might do with it, I guess I've sort of seen these sort of transformations in lots of different areas. And maybe the big step is kind of going from monitoring data to next building models that tell you something about the data to then trying to use the data in a predictive sense. And as that sort of joining up all those dots, I think becomes very interesting, very challenging, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because in some areas it's become very troublesome. So, you know, if I think about what we can do with data, it's all about improving efficiency, it's about becoming more competitive, making more money, reducing risk, all sorts of, you know, good things that you'd like to see our ability to harness this data. And big data, and what does that mean to me? I think of large quantities of data. It could be huge amounts of data running through time. It could be large amounts of data in a spatial sense. It could be data that's unstructured, structured, all kind of colliding together. And we get to a point very quickly where we've got a whole hard drive full of data and we're scratching our heads and thinking, okay, what possible sort of technology can I now use to visualize this? Can I look at it? How do I build a model out of it? So the kind of drivers, I suppose, that are around for making us, you know, why are we all here? Why do we think we could do something with all of this? And there's kind of three things I've identified. Back in 2007, we reached a sort of a critical threshold where the amount of data that's been produced in the world exceeded our ability to store that data. And that's kind of an interesting thought if you think about it. It really troubles some agencies around the world because they are trying to sift through data coming from messages, from SMS messages, from videos. You can imagine how quite quickly the amount of data is just huge. So if you go back in time, you know, a statistician, maybe the only people that ever looked at data, the job was you grab a piece of data, you analyze it, you build a model, you figure out what's going on, and then you kind of come back and sort of say, this is the result, I'm finished. And you just hope the world doesn't change and everything works out. Unfortunately, it's not like that anymore because the data and the world is changing so quickly. So, you know, we've got a lovely word for this in statistics. It's called non-stationarity. That doesn't maybe help you, but basically means that there are lots of structural changes. And if we've got lots and lots of data that's ticking through, then we suddenly have an advantage that we can actually sit there and sort of try and model the data on the fly. And this is called sort of data stream analytics, and that's something I'm very interested in. And that feeds right into our need, our desire to sort of figure out how we can build intelligent decision support systems. And obviously, like we had the example of Walmart, the quicker you can do that, the sort of more money you can make, the sort of more you can avoid horrible things happening in society. Hopefully, that's the sort of nice side of it. I'll give you some examples that are sort of close to my heart. I work a lot with the reinsurance industry, and I see that as a nice area to look at, because it's a mixture of physical scientists who look at the hazard, and then they've got to sort of take that hazard, their understanding of what causes earthquakes or floods or windstorms, and they kind of feed it through to, you have to work out how many buildings fall down, how many people get injured, how many people lose their jobs, what's the sort of knock-on effects. It very quickly becomes a sort of a social science problem. And the reinsurance industry, for a long time, basically were quite happy to write policies without having any model. They took an actuarial approach to things, so they would look at the past and they would work out what's the risk of a certain thing like a hurricane. And then there were a few events where a lot of them went insolvent and they disappeared, and they realized actually we need a sort of structured way about measuring risk. And so it was a sort of birth of what's known as catastrophe modeling organizations. And there's pretty much 3 of them in the world. There's a number that are cropping up now. And for sort of better or worse, this was like, insurance organizations outsourced their sort of ability to think about risk. They said, well, we've got 3 experts, that's all we need. Problem was that these guys, being commercially driven, decided that their intellectual property was worth a lot, and their black box approaches to measuring risk was very valuable. So they're not in any position willing to say what's inside that black box. And so they would work out what the risk was, and then they would lease out and collect nice revenues on a year-by-year basis. If you had enough money to compare all of the different models, you'll quickly see that they all had very different opinions about the world, which is a bit worrying if you kind of think these models are meant to be the best way of measuring risk. And that kind of comes right back to one important thing. When you go from data to models, you quickly figure out that there is no such thing as the best model in the world. That will never happen. So I like to take a kind of a pluralist view to it. Get as many models as you can, filter out the bad ones, and then average across the ones that you've got left. So one of the other interesting issues with insurance is that you quickly see that as you build models to figure out risk, and you look at individuals, households, or separate organizations, suddenly certain explanatory variables cross over that boundary where obviously we want insurance companies to price risk appropriately, so that we're not all paying lots of money because they don't really know what the risk is. But if individuals are being penalized because of certain information that those insurance companies have about them, then definitely we're in a sort of probably an unfair territory. So that's something I can kind of see cropping up in all of the discussions that we're probably going to have in the conference. And another sort of point I'd like to make are that there are lots of challenges, but there are a huge amount of opportunities here. So I've got sort of what I've kind of narrowed down into 5 different categories. I'd say one of them is just the fact that it's big data, data streams, huge amounts of data. How do you go about actually harnessing that? How do you go about using that data? It's not only the internet, it's also the other factors like weather sensors. Different disciplines are now in that position where they're just completely transforming the way they think. In psychiatry, patients would fill in forms maybe at the end of the week and they would hand them in. They got absolutely no feedback, and so they made up most of the stuff that was in the forms. Now you can do this on an intraday basis using a mobile telephone. So mobile telephones, I think, have been a real sort of catalyst behind, good or bad, creating this ability to have huge amounts of data. The second thing I see is how we interpret the data we've got. That's the first off thing. If we think about Twitter, I think this is great. We've got 140 characters to try and communicate what's in our minds. I've looked at lots of tweets, and often, it's very clear what someone is tweeting about, but other times it's really not at all obvious. And although there's lots of sentiment analysis techniques trying to classify these tweets, I still think they're really struggling in terms of just figuring out, was that a positive statement or was that a negative statement? And I've looked at some projects looking at the ability of Twitter to predict box office hits in advance, and there's definitely information inside the tweets that give us predictability beyond other variables. So there's no doubt there's definitely information in there. We just need to figure out how to pull that out. So the kind of, the first step again is monitoring something that's moving quite fast. Then we can kind of visualize it, we can see what's going on. Next step is how do we predict the future using this information? So the third point is transparency. As soon as you've got someone with a model that's built that model and they're using that to either influence policy or make decisions, how many people are going to be happy to sort of, like we go into a bank, we say, this is me, I want to borrow some money, someone taps something into a computer, and quickly the response is the computer says no, i.e. the model says no, your data says no. That might be, an okay way to do business, but maybe we really need to be sure that that model is supported by the sort of latest science or the sort of the best data that you could get. How do we know there's not sort of some corruption that's leaked into that system? An example again from insurance is that there's a number of models for hurricanes and how they make landfall in the US, and this industry is very model driven, and regulators wanted to become more model driven. So the people will work out the 1 in 200 year event, the worst case scenario, and then every insurance company that operates in Europe has to be able to withstand that event. So that number is really, really crucial to how your business will go forward. Last year there was an upgrade of one of the catastrophe modeling vendors. Basically they just changed the science and billions of dollars had to be moved around, not because the world changed in any way, but because the model changed. And you quickly start to realize that these models are becoming very powerful. They have a lot of influence in how we make decisions and how we think about things. So the fourth point is the evaluation of models, which kind of links on the back of the transparency issue. If someone has a black box, they're not interested in letting you see inside. That might be because of the commercial interests. It's also possibly because that they don't necessarily want you to evaluate their models. You can create lots of marketing and PR around a product that basically sounds very good, but unless there's an independent body that's in a position to evaluate and compare models, it's very difficult for the final end user to decide what they should do. So I see the predictability and the measurement, the standards, evaluation protocols, and the benchmarks that we need for forecasting as a crucial role in going from that data right through to modelling. Then the final thing is there's no such thing as sort of one scenario of the future. There's always going to be multiple scenarios. So we live in a resource-constrained planet. We're under lots of pressure to make the right decisions. We want to be resilient. We want to be sustainable. And we need to think about numbers of different ways that we can take all this data, these huge opportunities, and turn them into decision scenarios. And this links right back to what Helen was saying, that it's going to be probabilistic policy. And I don't know how many of you are statisticians, how many of you get excited about probability distributions, but most people do not get excited about that. They like things to be black and white. It's like you do this or you don't do it, not maybe you should do this with 75% probability. Those are the kind of issues I see as being very interesting as we go forward.
Wonderful summary, thank you. Finally, our last panelist, Theo.
Can you hear me if I talk from here? Can you hear me in the back? I see nodding heads. I feel completely daunted following Patrick, as when it comes to algorithms, statistics, even basic mathematics, I'm completely unqualified. This was brought home to me by my 2-year-old this morning, while I'm trying to learn to teach to count. And he can do 1, 2, 3, he can do 7, 8, 9, 10. He likes the word 6. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 6. 7, 8, 9, 10, 6. Whatever numbers we do, it's always 6. So I'm not going to claim any level of expertise on algorithms or statistics or even basic counting. I work on public policy for Google in the UK, so that largely means I talk to government in the UK and policymakers, mostly about the internet. And I also talk back to Mountain View, California, and try and help Google understand kind of why Britain might be different to America. And before that, I used to work in government. So the areas where I feel I might be able to give some insight today would be on the kind of how the commercial side, how Google sees data and big data, and you know, where we are in the public sector and what might be the hold-ups and how we might get around them. So on the commercial side, I think the period where we went to conferences saying big data is the next big thing is kind of already over, and we're now in the bit where people are saying, well, why isn't the big data thing already here everywhere? And you know, there are lots of reports on how big data is changing businesses. From our perspective, we're seeing more and more data-driven decisions being taken by both small and large companies. And interesting, from our position, we see that the gateway for a company, for a small company often, to start becoming a data decision-making company is their website. So they look at their analytics on their website and they start to think about how they're going to change their website based on the data that they see there. And then they can start to make the leap from how they change their website to how they might change their whole business. And it doesn't seem that too distant thinking if you're an online retail business or if you're a pure internet company. There are clearly lots of good reasons why companies are adopting data-driven models. And I'm talking about data here, not just big data. I don't ever know quite where data starts to become big data, so I'm blurring these two things. But clearly, it increases efficiency and productivity. Lots of studies show this. Eric Brynjolfsson in the MIT in the US estimates a 3 to 5% increase in productivity. We see real-time and continuous performance analysis. My favorite example of this is UPS, who did a modeling where they persuaded every one of their drivers always to turn right. This is in the US. It wouldn't work in the UK. Obviously, it would be a disaster. But they found that if you always turn right, it actually ended up quicker. And that could only really be done with large amounts of big data and lots of modeling. And then statistical tested scale. So this is something that Google does a lot of, but when we're introducing changes to our algorithm, we'll maybe do a short group and then start to build it out wider. The example I would give here is the color of Google's link. You know, the blue link on our page. There's about 70 different kinds of blue that we could have picked for that. And I'm sure if we'd have got a designer to tell us what color that link should be, they would say that we've gone for a terrible color. It's so boring, that blue. But what we did was we modeled at scale. So we have 2 billion users, so we can take quite large sample groups. And we could model every different shade of that blue and work out which one led to the most links. And that's the color that we now use. So they're kind of just sensible decision making, but at scale. And we'll see more and more of that. And the interesting thing is we're seeing it both at big and small companies. So the small companies, they are more willing to take risk. And I think risk, the culture of risk is a really important factor for both commercial and public sector. And those who adopt and those who are held back, the risk factor is really important. Patrick was talking about the 75% probability. I think everyone sees it as 25% risk. And no one sees it as the likelihood of what's going to happen. It's the fear of what might happen. And so small companies are often the ones who are more likely to take the risk. Although they sometimes are held back or put off by the regulatory threat that they feel from privacy laws or data protection laws or copyright laws around data analytics. These kind of things can present barriers to small companies. For the bigger companies, it's about most of those that are willing to take the risk will do so. But for many of them, it's a kind of cultural thing. Are they ready really to say that the way in which they've always taken decisions based on their gut or based on the experience of their senior staff is now going to change? It's just going to be based on an algorithm. That's quite a hard thing to do, even for the largest companies. But clearly we're seeing that those companies that do take the leap into data-driven decision-making see the benefit. And when we move to the public sector, there's also tons of literature here about how good this is going to be for governments, for the public purse. There was a McKinsey study which claimed that there would be 250 billion euros worth of savings to be had from in public sector administration. Policy Exchange, the UK think tank, did a It's used the same methodology to look at what the figure would be for the UK, and I think they estimated 16 to 33 billion. So you're kind of thinking, well, why doesn't this happen already? Why don't we just do this tomorrow? And to be fair to government, it is starting to happen. The White House, I think, had a $200 million budget for big data. The UK, I don't think Francis Maud makes a speech anymore without using the words big data. And the work that Nigel Chabot and his team are doing around open data, we are seeing definite signs of progress. But what I would say here, and this is really kind of going back to my own experience in government, is don't expect a big bang. Nothing is going to happen quickly. There are very good reasons why government isn't going to move fast on this, and it comes back to this idea of risk. That the companies that are able to embrace big data are those that are happy to take on the risk, and that's often the small, flighty ones, or the big companies with the capital to take risk. Governments at the moment, they're always risk averse, but at the moment they don't have the capital to be able to take risks. And if you're a minister sitting in a department, the question when it comes to big data, before you even get into the discussion around risks, is, well, why should I do this? This is not the most important thing in my intro. If you're in charge of, if you're Michael Gove and you're in charge of the education curriculum and you're looking at GCSEs or O-levels and how we should restructure these, then before you can even start to have a conversation with them about big data, he's just thinking, yeah, but I've just got to do these really difficult things here. And what you're talking about is newfangled science, I'm not ready for that. So it will take time, but we are beginning to see it come in, and we're seeing it coming in at kind of the edges of government, where there's collaboration with smaller businesses, and through things like open data, bringing in people from outside government to experiment at relatively little risk and no cost to government. But I think it's also worth kind of drilling down into the sense of what that risk is for government, because I think, because we coming from where Google is, we often have thought of the risk as being around privacy concerns. But I think actually it's really about security. For government, it's much more about collecting these big piles of data just seems a dangerous thing. I was working for Gordon Brown when the news came in around that we thought we had lost, but we weren't sure, 25 million people's data about their tax payments. And we thought, but we weren't sure, that someone might have put this on a CD and sent it through the post. And it kind of illustrates all of the problems with big data, kind of how you move it around and kind of and what can be stored and what can be done with that data. But crucially, it's really about the security of it. And those kind of fears, like an NHS IT project, which is seen as a colossal waste of money, those kind of fears are going to take a long time for us to overcome if we want to persuade policymakers that big data is actually going to save money, is going to be better for delivering public policy. And it's quite well-grounded risk in that sense. And so in terms of how it will change, I would say it's already changed at the edges. Now, a good example I would pick out would be the Transport for London real-time travel data, which Google now puts into Google Maps, and you can all sorts of different apps, not just Google ones, that you can use to access that data. Worked out at relatively little cost to TfL, huge benefit to the consumer, to the user. And so I think another thing that will change in government will be kind of data-savvy decision makers coming through. I think it'll take time, but we're already seeing in supermarkets that if you're running Tesco's today, you are a data-savvy manager. You're getting used to looking at big amounts of big data, and that's what's driving where you're putting things, how you're starting, and that will happen through the civil service as well. It will be some time behind, but as that comes through, that will start to make people feel more confident about those data decisions. The other thing that I would say, and this is kind of a lesson that we're going through as well as a company, I think when you look at how, it's interesting when you look at how confident people feel about iTunes, Amazon, or the Nike app, which tells you how fast you should run. People are willing to let into their lives an algorithm decide what is the next song I want to listen to, or an algorithm decide how much faster I should run today. Or even in my case, and don't tell my sister this, an algorithm on Amazon suggesting what I should buy for Christmas. And these are quite personal decisions, but they're taken really by big data sets about anonymous people that is influencing my choices. And the reason why I do that is because of the utility to me as the consumer at those points. And the thing I think that we're learning as Google as a company, and which I think, for those who are academics working on this, for policymakers working on this, for governments, is not to think about what is the use to us as a company, to us as a government, to us as academics in our studies, but what is the value to the user, to the citizen, to the consumer, which it comes back to the question I think you asked at the very beginning, which is, do people want to use these tools? And I think that has to be the focus. If you build things that people want to use, then we'll actually see big data come through quite quickly. And I'll leave it there.
Great note to end on. Thank you.